As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So on Friday night, the UN Security Council met and voted on a resolution for a ceasefire in Gaza, a real ceasefire. And 13 out of the 15 members voted in favor of it. One member, the UK, abstained from voting, and only one member voted against the ceasefire in Gaza, and that was the US. And because the US is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, it has veto power. So that means it killed the resolution. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Saturday said that he appreciated the U.S. vetoing a UN Security Council resolution that called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and vowed to continue his war in the besieged enclave, which has killed at least 18,000 Palestinians. And that's the latest update from Gaza's health ministry that they put out Sunday. So Netanyahu said, quote, "Other countries must also understand that it's impossible to support the elimination of Hamas on one side and on the other to call for the end of the war, which will prevent the elimination of Hamas. Therefore, Israel will continue our just war to eliminate Hamas and achieve the war's other objectives that we set," end quote. So the U.S. is facing global backlash and criticism from fellow UN Security Council members for being the only one to vote against a ceasefire resolution, as Israel is killing civilians at a historic pace. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gambled that a strong Hamas, but not too strong, would keep the peace and reduce pressure for a Palestinian state. So this is the report here I'm just going to read from. Just weeks before Hamas launched the deadly October 7th attacks on Israel, the head of Mossad arrived in Doha, Qatar for a meeting with Qatari officials. For years, the Qatari government had been sending millions of dollars a month into the Gaza Strip, money that helped prop up the Hamas government there. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel not only tolerated these payments, he had encouraged them. During his meetings in September with the Qatari officials, according to several people familiar with the secret discussions, the Mossad chief David Barnea was asked a question that had not been on the agenda. Did Israel want the payments to continue? So again, this is Qatar asking Israel if they want these payments to Hamas to continue. And Mr. Netanyahu's government had recently decided to continue the policy, so Mr. Barnea said yes, the Israeli government still welcomed the money from Doha. Allowing the payments, billions of dollars over roughly a decade, was a gamble by Mr. Netanyahu that a steady flow of money would maintain peace in Gaza, the eventual launching point of the October 7th attacks, and keep Hamas focused on governing, not fighting. The Qatari payments, while ostensibly a secret, have been widely known and discussed in the Israeli news media for many years. And this says basically, it's under much more scrutiny now, and Netanyahu's political opponents are really going after him for this. So the Biden administration is bypassing Congress to get 13,000 rounds of tank ammunition to Israel to fuel its onslaught in Gaza by waiving a congressional review period for foreign weapons sales. So on Friday night, the State Department notified Congress that it was going through with the $106 million sale of 120 millimeter tank ammunition. The U.S. provides Israel with $3.3 billion in foreign military financing each year. So that's money they give Israel that Israel can use to buy U.S. weapons. It's unclear if those funds are being used for this particular sale. A State Department official told the New York Times that the administration invoked an emergency provision in the Arms Export Control Act to push through the sale without congressional oversight. Secretary of State Antony Blinken personally approved the sale and defended the move on Sunday. Blinken said, quote, "Israel is in combat right now with Hamas, and we want to make sure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself against Hamas," end quote. It's Israel killing over 7,000 children is defending itself, apparently. Satsi Hanegbi, and that's Netanyahu's national security advisor, he said on Saturday that Israel was ready to act against the Houthis in Yemen if the U.S. and its allies do not. He said, quote, "Israel is giving the world some time to organize in order to prevent this, but if there isn't going to be a global arrangement because it is a global issue, we will act in order to remove this naval siege," end quote. So the Houthis have been targeting Israeli-linked commercial vessels and firing missiles and drones at Israel in response to the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. Hanegbi's comments came after reports that said the Biden administration told Israel to leave it to the U.S. to take care of the Houthis. U.S. officials have told Politico that the Biden administration is not planning to strike the Houthis, at least for now. The U.S. has backed a Saudi-led coalition in a war against the Houthis since 2015, although a ceasefire has held relatively well since April 2022. Any U.S. attacks on the Houthis could threaten that truce, and that's something apparently the Saudis have conveyed to the U.S. They don't want the U.S. bombing Yemen. For the time being, the U.S. is looking to form an international naval task force to get its allies to help protect commercial shipping in the Red Sea. The Houthis have shown no sign of backing down. They're warning that they will target any ships that are bound for Israel. And on Sunday, the French military said that a French frigate shot down 2 drones in the Red Sea that were fired from Yemen. So the French are getting in on the action now. And the situation in Yemen in the Red Sea is just one area where Israel's assault on Gaza is spilling out into the region. Israel and Hezbollah have traded fire across the Israeli-Lebanon border, and Israeli officials are now threatening war in Lebanon if Hezbollah does not move back from its border. The Israeli defense minister did it last week, and now Hanegbi is making similar comments, basically saying Hezbollah, they don't want them on the border. They want to push them back, and if they can't find a diplomatic agreement, then the military is going to have to act. And Netanyahu has threatened major destruction in Beirut if the situation with Hezbollah escalates into a full-blown war. So he said this a few days ago, quote, "If Hezbollah decides to open an all-out war, then with its own hands, it will turn Beirut and southern Lebanon, which are not far from here, into Gaza and Khan Yunis," end quote, saying they'll reduce Beirut, the capital of Lebanon, to rubble.
Well, I mean, I think, again, it's very frustrating, Scott. We talked a lot about this a little bit off camera, which is that, you spend 2 years saying a certain thing's going to happen. You're called an idiot and a Putin lover for those 2 years. And then the mainstream media, realizing that it's happening that way, starts putting out articles saying, the counteroffensive didn't go very well. Oh, Ukraine on the brink, this, that, and the other. So it is very frustrating to have to endure this all the time. The default should just be like every neocon claim is garbage from the get-go, but they get away with it over and over again. But yeah, you're seeing mainstream. Washington Post had a devastating article earlier this week. Even The Economist, chief cheerleader for this war, they're realizing they have to get out in front of this failure. Otherwise, it might look like they've been wrong all along. But politically, it's a big deal. There was a fiasco in the Senate this week where Zelensky was supposed to address a closed-door classified session of senators. Republicans got there, and the whole thing looked like a complete joke. So they left, and Zelensky was tipped off to the fact that it was basically an empty room. He flipped out, got super PO'd, and canceled it himself. So huge fiasco for Ukraine in sort of a last-ditch effort to sweet-talk the Americans out of some more money.
What would happen if America stopped supporting Ukraine? And he goes, well, let's look at the history here. And he brings up again this all-important story that's now quintuply confirmed, or maybe even more, about how they were really making progress in the talks at the beginning of the war, where the Russians were going to withdraw back out of the country. I'm sure they're going to still recognize the supposed independence of Donetsk and Luhansk or some kind of deal, but they were essentially going to end the war and withdraw their troops from certainly what's happened since then. And Zelensky was prepared to sign it until the Americans and the Brits forced him to quit. Yeah.
Typical. It's typical. I mean, it's come out, and that was admitted by the top advisor to Zelensky, David Arakhamia, admitted that. I think in The Economist it was last week that this is what's happened. Boris Johnson. I don't know if you saw this, Scott, but he called for his government to come up with a plan for a military raid on the Netherlands to get some vaccines from them. This guy is unhinged. He's as nutty as a fruit. I mean, our rulers are so insane and so stupid. I mean, if just looking at who is ruling over us doesn't make you libertarian, I don't know what will.
Yeah,
But yeah, he's a guy that literally rolled in and said, "No, you guys can't do this. Don't worry, we'll give you everything you want. Don't worry, you guys. Fight on, boys. Fight on, boys." Mm-hmm. And then he went off to guzzle a few gallons of whiskey or something.
It's just incredible. It is. See, it seems sort of unreal. But then you go, well, look at Boris Johnson. Look at Kamala Harris. I saw the headline. I didn't believe. I mean, who knows what they really mean by these things, but that they even try this. It's like a TV show. They go, well, Kamala Harris is now in charge of Gaza policy. Oh, come on. Like some of us have work to do here. Stop wasting my time with this craziness, and this kind of thing. Like you say, Boris freaking Johnson somehow became the prime minister of Britain. Already I'm accusing you of pulling my leg. And now he come in and completely blew up a peace negotiation. And as you say, this guy, David Arakhamia, he was the leader of the Ukrainian delegation, now confirming this part of the story. And so, and look, and as Connor O'Keefe says in this piece, Dan, he says, you could see what they were thinking, that Ukraine's initial resistance to Russia was so successful compared to what they thought was going to happen that they said, all right, let's go for broke. Instead of, that's a relief that the entire military and state didn't get smashed to smithereens. And so at least we'll be able to salvage something. Let's compromise now and accept our 2/3 of a loaf. And instead, I don't know what Zelensky was thinking, but the Americans and the Brits were thinking, no, now's the time to press our advantage, which they never had.
Let's roll into Moscow. But that whole thing, Scott, is only because they believe their own bullcrap, because they incorrectly concluded that for Russia, it was about taking territory, even though Putin was very explicit It's about demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. And so when they initially went into Kiev and took a couple airfields, but didn't continue on and capture the city, the geniuses in DC, in the Beltway, and their allies across Europe concluded incorrectly that this was plucky little Ukraine standing up for itself, when in fact, people that we know who actually are experts, like McGregor and Ritter and the others, Johnson, they knew all along. I mean, it was very obvious. They did not want to have to occupy Kiev at this point. Their goals, which they were explicit about, were demilitarization, denazification, and they continue grinding onward. But the U.S. can't, these people can't let go of this idea that wars are only about territorial conquest. You know, that's the only thing they can think. So this whole thing was built on a lie anyway.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of that, switch gears back to U.S. politics again. Vivek Ramaswamy took it to Nikki Haley in, I guess, what's the final Republican debate of the season last night by challenging her to name any of the provinces in eastern Ukraine that she wants America to fight for. And man, that was great. She just
That was a
sat
great
there.
moment. I mean, he is a mixed bag, but when he's on, he's on fire.
And that's a real risk, because she could have said, what, are you kidding me? Of course it's Donetsk and Luhansk and Zaporozhye and Kherson and whatever. Like, that ain't that hard, bro. We got to save Kharkiv before it falls back under Russian domination. Like, that's any idiot could tell you that if you want to take that point of view. So he was making a gamble, but he gambled right. She didn't have the first clue. She never heard of Donetsk and Luhansk. She don't know nothing about it, Dan, nothing.
Do you sense a general realization among Western elites, except for Joe Biden and Blinken and the White House and the State Department, that Ukraine has been, that the war in Ukraine is over and Ukraine can go nowhere?
Except for the people in London, yes, there's a wide recognition that that far from what Biden said 2 months ago, that Russia has already lost, it's just the other way around. It got mixed up, okay? Russia had already won. Now, the question is what he's going to tell Zelensky on Wednesday. My God, why would he want Zelensky coming in to talk to him tete-a-tete? I fear the worst. These guys are in real trouble. What kind of deus ex machina, what kind of special surprise, special false flag operation are they planning? I mean, that's the only thing that makes sense for them to meet. So, yeah, I'm really worried, because as all these other leaders watch on, they also see that Biden and his coterie of sophomores have a lot of stake in this, not least of all the election.
So the Israelis claim that they have arrested IDF. They have arrested Hamas fighters who threw their weapons down. The Gazans say these are not Hamas fighters. These are civilians who've been kidnapped, stripped down to their underwear, and paraded around on Israeli cameras, an express violation. Well, the kidnapping is a violation of the Geneva Conventions. The occupier can't kidnap, and the parading is a violation. This morning earlier today, I asked Alistair Crook about it. So we have juxtaposed Alistair's comments on this with background footage, what we call B-roll, of these unfortunate guys being shown on camera in their underwear. They're a little blurred. It's not lurid. It looks like they're wearing bathing suits, but it's a war crime. Take a look.
It's becoming quite clear that actually Hamas is not being defeated. I mean, when you see Israel rounding up a whole lot of civilians from a local shelter in their underwear and then filming them and say they're sort of seized Hamas prisoners, you realize that Israel is having to try and find ways of convincing its public that this exercise has been a success. I don't think they have even touched the main force of Hamas, which is underground still. They've just managed to treat it a little bit at the edges, but not the main part of it. And at the same time, they've destroyed their image in the world. Overall, completely. But Biden is committed to giving them as much time as possible to try and destroy Hamas. But meanwhile, as I say, I think Hamas understood this. They are able to last much longer than perhaps Biden or Netanyahu is in this fight. And then I think that they expect that Israel will go for Hezbollah. And that will mean we will move up the ladder of escalation to the next level.
Interesting observation that Hamas will be around longer than Biden or Netanyahu. Why is there no outrage at this? You expressed profound outrage. We ran the clip over and over the weekend. Why aren't people in the State Department resigning and publishing the documents, showing, demonstrating United States duplicity in Ukraine and in Israel?
Judge,
but there would be outrage anywhere else in the world of any other country. If Putin stripped down Ukrainian prisoners to their underwear and took pictures of them, there'd be outrage.
That would be different because he wants to take over Europe. I make a joke, sick
Of
joke.
course, yeah.
I mean, the problem is, look, I'm around long enough to remember photos of Auschwitz and Buchenwald and Dachau, and those photos are very reminiscent of what happened then, okay? So never again, except for the Israelis. They can do never again what happened to them. Now, these photos are going viral around the rest of the world. You don't see them on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post. There have been some little improvement in that, but that hasn't happened yet. So it's really up to us. We are enabling all this stuff. We have to tell our representatives, our senators, and anybody else who has any power at all, look, that's enough is enough. Never again means never again for everyone, especially for people who have suffered. Never again.
Over the weekend, the Biden administration, bypassing Congress, sent 13,000 rounds of tank ammunition and another 106 million in tanks and tank spare parts to Israel, bypassing Congress, using emergency legislation enacted at the time of World War II. The purpose of the emergency legislation is to defend the national security of the United States of America. So in order to bypass Congress, it was necessary for Secretary Blinken to sign a document under oath that whatever he was bypassing Congress on was necessary to support the national security of the United States. Is it even conceivable how giving this money to Israel, bypassing Congress, bypassing the Constitution, bypassing federal law, is necessary for the security of the United States?
It's not conceivable. It is conceivable if Biden thinks this is necessary for him to win the election, or the people around him think that's the case. It's so politically cynical.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
You this week posted something about an interesting figure, $41,000. What was that $41,000 in reference to?
Yeah, so that's new data from the Social Security Agency, and that is their tally for the median income for American workers. In other words, half of American workers make less than that, 41,000, and that comes out to about $3,400 a month. Now, once you take the median rent in the United States is about $2,000. The median car payment for a used car is about $542, I think. Once you're done with that, you've got about $892 left, and you've got to do your groceries, your gasoline, the car repairs, the health insurance, clothes, any kind of sick kids. You've got to cover all of that with $892. And so I'm sympathetic to Gene that in many ways life is much better than it was in the past. But at the same time, point one is that a lot of people I think are genuinely struggling. This is not just lazy millennials. This is literally, they are in a spot where they can essentially only dream of the lifestyle that they themselves grew up in, right? So they might have grown up in a 4-bedroom house with, that their parents owned. And when they look at that now and they're, getting into their 40s, they're with the roommates, they're eating ramen, that's just a complete science fiction outcome for them. They can't imagine getting there. They're light years from starting a family. And so, yes, we have iPhones, we have internet, we have all kinds of technological innovation because the rest of us innovate even as the government tries to stop it. But at the same time, the question is, have we lost that sort of American dream trajectory where each generation is much, much wealthier than their parents, right? To the point where the parents look at the kids and say, I can't imagine what an amazing world you live in. We couldn't imagine that. We had to go uphill both ways in the snow. All right. And that has now become today where you've got 30-somethings who are dreaming nostalgically of the luxurious lifestyle in which they grew up.
I saw, and in fact, I think I might have it open in one of my tabs here, from a few months ago. This is on CNBC. Headline, 63% of workers unable to pay a $500 emergency expense.
Yeah.
So what does that look like? How do people, you're on the edge of catastrophe at all times. And that has to take a toll on you mentally.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and the amazing thing, of course, so I was living in Taiwan for about 5 years. And what's interesting about Taiwan is that the average household wealth in Taiwan, I believe, is actually substantially higher than it is in the U.S. Now, Taiwan is a much poorer country. So why is that? And I would argue that the reason is because the safety net in Taiwan is not nearly as complete or as generous as it is in the U.S. And so what ends up happening is, in Taiwan, for example, if you lose your job, people don't ask if you're going to go on government benefits, right? People ask, well, what kind of business are you going to start in the meantime? Okay, the assumption is that you're going to go down and rent a food cart All right. You're going to take that out somewhere. You can pay rent to find a spot in these night markets, very cheap. You'll pay $50 to get a sign made, and you'll be up and running that evening, earning income whilst you look for a job during the day. Okay. It's a completely different mentality. Whereas I think the $500, right? The fact that in a nation this wealthy, that 63% cannot afford I mean, people are like driving on the edge of the cliff all the time. And I think a big reason for that is the safety net, right? It is that we've created moral hazard where people do not save enough. They spend way up to the limit. They figure they'll just go on credit and then something will happen. So yeah, I think without a doubt. And of course, the upshot for policy is that any politician who would propose some of the sort of tough medicine type policies, Jim Grant talks about in The Forgotten Depression, the sort of standard recession response back in the 19th century. Anybody who talks like that, you are going to have the media trolling up millions of people who are suffering, those exact people who are living right on the edge. And at that point, there is going to be no tolerance in the public conversation for discussions about personal responsibility. People are going to think, well, okay, sure, in the abstract, we can talk about that when the recession is over. And so the end result is that every crisis, I think, it grows. You have this ratchet effect that is much larger than it would be if we didn't have such an expansive welfare state.
All right, so the welfare state contributes in some way. But if somebody said to you, all of this struggling that we're doing goes to show that the system doesn't work, you might well agree with them because it depends on what you mean by the system. But what they mean by the system is quote unquote capitalism, and capitalism doesn't work. But the thing is that historically, for hundreds of years, capitalism, the result of it has been to bring, thinking in terms of purchasing power, the price of everything more and more within the reach of ordinary people. So why would the system suddenly reverse course? So how would you defend the market economy that you and I believe in?
Right. So capitalism, of course, means different things to different people. So the left uses it to mean the, sort of perfect free market, orthodoxy, every man for himself, the law of the jungle. And I think as Austrians, we understand that, if we're talking about the current system, that is, of course, a mixture. It is an enormous amount of government interference. Government at all levels spends about half of all the spending in the American economy. If you add on what's regulated, what's mandated, I mean, we are a mostly socialist system. And
came to how a free people should respond to government usurpation. So usurpation is a theft of power from the sovereign people of the several states today. The people are the source of all power. So whatever the setup is, when government goes beyond its limits, it's stealing, and it shouldn't be doing that. But what do you do about it? Do you go to the government and just try to convince the government to stop doing what the government wasn't supposed to do in the first place? Well, for a very moderate guy like Dickinson, certainly that was the first step. But you don't stop at the first step if the first step doesn't work, because government isn't sovereign. Government doesn't have final say over the people. So he said citizens, this is not a quote, but citizens, this is from an article by Rob Nailson, The Message of the Farmer Letters, citizens should oppose small usurpations immediately to prevent them from acquiring the force of precedent. For people like Dickinson and so many others of the old revolutionaries, precedent was the great problem. And Thomas Jefferson talked about this years later in his opposition to the so-called constitutionality of the National Bank in 1791, saying that if you take a single step beyond the limits of the Constitution, you allow them to do that, then the rules don't matter. You've basically given them a boundless field of power, is how Jefferson put it. So Dickinson also took this position. In one of his letters in the Farmer Letters, he specifically was pointing out how some people were saying this is not as bad as the Stamp Act, so we shouldn't get too worked up about it. And he's like, no, it's the other way around. And I'm paraphrasing this. Of course, he would be much more eloquent than I. But he's basically saying even the smallest thing is the greatest worry, because that's the one that doesn't bring up all the alarm that the large steps. And each of those small steps establishes a precedent that builds and builds and builds. And then all of a sudden you're like, well, wow, now we're underwater. This thing is really nasty. Things are really bad. And you can see how government doesn't go from, well, what's supposed to be limited to the largest in history in one fell swoop. But he said in a number of letters, so in letters 11 and 12, one, for example, a perpetual jealousy. Now, this is not like a relationship jealousy, but talking about paying attention, like, oh, okay, we're on guard for people who might attack liberty. A perpetual jealousy regarding liberty is absolutely required in all free states. Perpetual, constant, no matter what. Even if you get the people in there that you like, you still have to constantly be on guard, because human nature and the nature of power, the maxims of all through history show that, well, corrupt people go to positions of power, and then power always expands. Even when good guys are in there, they try to use it for good things, but they don't live forever, and they don't stay in power forever, and eventually the bad guys get in power. And so you never want to actually advocate for more government power, really, which they did not follow all of their own recommendations, but that's human nature. So perpetual jealousy regarding liberty is absolutely required in all free states. And in letter 12, he said, let us take care of our rights and we therein take care of our prosperity. Slavery is ever preceded by sleep. So if you have to consider something that is almost never talked about, really, the Quartering Act, or at least the first one in 1765, that came out around the same time. It was given royal assent on May 15th of that year and provided that Great Britain would house its soldiers in American barracks and public houses. I'm not going to get into details on that, but really the end result is what's most important. The back and forth, the resistance, the ramp up by government, the resistance, the ramp up by government just keeps going through this process. When 1,500 British troops, and this is from Wiki, arrived at New York City in 1766, the New York Provincial Assembly refused to comply with the Quartering Act and did not supply billeting for the troops. The troops had to remain on their ships. This is a huge embarrassment to the empire. They're just saying, this local assembly say we're not going to do what you tell us to do. And mind you, it wasn't just New York. It was circumvented basically in all of the colonies except Pennsylvania, where Dickinson is from, surprisingly, but they were just not participating to various degrees in the enforcement of that. And here from Mike Meharry then, so their follow-up to that, the British then, of course, government always tries to ramp it up. They follow up in 1767. They followed up passing 4 laws together known as the Townshend Acts. These laws imposed new taxes on the importation of paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea, and expanded the British government's power to fight smuggling. They did not like people having a more free market. They liked the regulated market, just like today. They also included something called the New York Restraining Act. And the New York Restraining Act, and I think they were trying to single out New York, because they were trying to make an example of New York for refusing to comply with the Quartering Act. And I think the Quartering Act of 1765 had actually even been repealed shortly after that or around that time, but they still didn't like the idea of the colonies getting uppity. And we see this happen today. The central government, the former federal government in Washington, D.C., they like to basically take action against states who get out of line. They're always threatening them with something. And this is the way that government works. So they punished New York by basically saying, well, we're not going to allow you to go into session anymore. And this, of course, led to more resistance by the people. And Meharry puts it this way: as with the Stamp Act, published protests led to more concrete actions. And I'm jumping through this just very briefly. But in March of 1768, a committee of Boston merchants drafted a series of resolutions establishing an agreement to stop buying most goods imported from England. They're like, okay, well, if you're going to keep trying to boss us around, we're going to hit you in the wallet, where we know that's the most impact on you people. And finally, Mike writes, on August 1st of 1768, approximately 60 Boston merchants and traders signed an agreement based on resolutions. On those resolutions, only 16 refused to do so. I mean, that was a pretty significant amount, but this was really the beginning of this process of saying, well, we're just not going to participate in a bigger and bigger way. Then we also have down in Virginia, the Virginia Association. George Washington suggested a broad non-importation agreement in response to the Townshend Acts. He suggested it to George Mason, who worked with Richard Henry Lee, and they drafted one up. And here's, for example, a little bit from this as well. They will not at any time hereafter directly or indirectly import or cause to be imported any manner of goods, merchandise, or manufactures which are or shall hereafter be taxed by act of Parliament for the purpose of raising a revenue in America. So they're just saying, if you're going to try to tax us, we won't do that business anymore, because you don't deserve to get that money. It's illegal for you to do it, and we're going to starve the beast until we can get back to normal.
This first clip is essentially what we're talking about. This was on Edge. Plenty of stories out there about this, but this was on Thursday. Jews genocide and how the universities were lost. He says, for decades, our elite institutions and media have treated free speech as increasingly dangerous. As Alex Berenson highlights in an excellent summary, they have used their power to put topics off limits, especially those that expose racial differences. Like most evil, censorship metastasizes. Universities now police even the smallest offenses against minority or self-declared marginalized groups. Now go to the next one. This has that picture that you like, Dr. Paul, of those university presidents, of Ivy League university presidents. They're being grilled before Congress. And the article goes on talking about the rot that's out there on campus. Last year, Harvard declared misgendering, that is referring to transgender people that pronoun of their actual birth gender, as a form of abuse. The year before, Columbia had declared it a fireable offense. This attitude, this context, to use the word heard frequently on Tuesday, which is last Tuesday when the hearing took place, is what makes Tuesday's congressional testimony by three presidents of elite American universities so shameful, fraught, and hypocritical. So this is a cultural rot. This is a rot that's been going on a long time, and to a degree, it was exposed in the hearings last week. But the real question is, what were the motives behind the exposition of this? Is there any hypocrisy involved, and what's the way out? I think.
Yes, and they asked the question about who should regulate this, because they're talking about speech. What can you say and what you can't say? And I think they have an impossible task. And I've often said this. And I was even thinking about grade school and high school when they might have dressing codes. Who does it? You want to have it. You want to protect civil liberties. At the same time, you don't want to have people not acting civilized. So you have to have some rules. And I struggled with that. And the only thing I could come up with is the entity that's closest to the management. If we have the government, it's the local community, but not the UN or the federal government or the state government even. And that would be the way to handle this. But right now, if you're going to control speech, you have to ask what speeches would be controlled and how do you do it. And I don't think it's possible to take all these universities and have a code of conduct. They might just want to tinker with that, you know. And I think what we're witnessing now is this tinkering around and government involvement and philosophers' involvement for all these years. And you would think of the deterioration since 1913. The universities have been the instigators of all this. But I think what is happening right now is a conclusion of this effort, because I make the analogy frequently to economics, because in economics they've been tinkering since the progressive era, and we still have a monster system, and people are just waiting for it to collapse. And in a way, this is a social thing. They're waiting for this to collapse, and it will. But it's to me, people don't understand the First Amendment. People don't have people have really rights of free speech if you own your property. If it's somebody's church or somebody's home, you're not going to have a government agent at the door. They might try to, especially if you're broadcasting or something. They want to invade and take care of it. But they want to come in and regulate that. But most people understand, no, we don't want the government doing this, and we don't want the government taking control of the speech in the First Amendment. But the whole thing is that's what they think they should do. But I think what we should do is just wean ourselves off this absolute dependency on the government. And I think whoever puts the money in has a say-so. And it's the taxpayers, it's the politicians, and then they come up with all this wokeism. And it's just their tool. I mean, that's an army set up of people who believe in wokeism. And wokeism is not a nice system. I think it is contrary to the principles of liberty. I think it's contrary to common sense, and it's the last thing that we need. And yet they're riding a high horse right now, and they're doing well. But the reason I think this picture, especially that we looked at, I think it's so interesting because they have some sour faces there, and they good. And that system should get some sour faces too, because I've had my kids go to state universities and all, and I remember one of them coming up, he says, "Dad, my teacher that teaches me economics is a declared communist." So how do you handle that? When it's government, it's harder to do it. But if it was in our private school or my homeschooling group, I'll tell you what, we have the right and the obligation to regulate it, and we regulate speech through voluntarism and through property rights.
Yeah, that's all we can do. Well, the last one is more of an update, but it's actually kind of news, which is tomorrow, believe it or not, Dr. Paul, and this is going to shock you, guess who's back in town? Not Santa Claus coming to town. No, Zelensky. It's a reverse Santa Claus, right? Instead of giving you stuff, he takes stuff. So believe it or not, now we've been talking about this on the show for a while, that the Biden administration is getting desperate. Last week, I don't know if you saw this, but Tucker Carlson tweeted out that a source of his in Congress told him that in a closed-door meeting, Secretary of Defense Austin told members of Congress, if you don't vote this money for us, we're going to send your kids and your family and your nephews out to fight in this war, a real threat. And Biden has been essentially saying the same thing. He said, if Ukraine doesn't win, American troops will be fighting Russia in Europe. And they've been also talking about the domino theory. Putin, when he finishes with Ukraine, is going to take over Berlin. He's going to take over London, Amsterdam. He's going to town. He's going to be over here soon. They've been going full court press to try to get this money.
The saddest thing that I come across looking at all this and seeing this activity is that so much harm and killing and waste and suffering and starvation all could be prevented. It's not like we don't know what does it, but there's so much greed in the country where people want to make money on this, and they go along with this, and it to me is such a tragedy. One tragedy I see that I really am annoyed by is when I see the handicapped veterans coming back.
Oh, yeah.
And I think, they're making it. They're heroic in them not giving up. But it's so criminal because how about the people that died, the civilians that died, the people who are suffering now without their limbs or blinded and stuff like that. And I thought, it could have all been prevented.
Yeah.
This didn't fall out of the sky. People created this monster.